Okay. So thank you very much for this invitation to speak. Usually I'm speaking at conferences or on panels, and time is restricted or the subject matter is restricted. But this invitation was very open. And it was really about my history as an artist, which has had many different cycles. Um, so I've indulged myself. I don't know. We've opened this for 2 hours, but we might condense it. We'll see. 2 hours is like a major film. I don't know. Um, but I certainly have many, many slides to show. And what I would like to do is just read a couple of pages to just get us sort of focused. And then I'm going to really do images and really sort of present it as a storytelling experience. Since I know this history oh so well, and I've been immersed in it for many, many years. So why don't I begin with just this short introduction, and then we'll move into a more conversational mode. With time to discuss the relationship between this history and today's political environment. You can never really exclude the political environment when you're dealing with public art. It's required, really. So I do want to thank JWAN and the WCA for sponsoring this. And especially to Karen Luna, who is the operative director and who I've worked with closely, working on the 501c3 sponsorship. Just for everyone's information, the WCA was founded in 1972 as part of the College of Art Associations. So it has a long history and an important history. I joined in 1988, and it really marked a change in my own identity as an artist, and directions that I was taking at that point in my life, which I will share more specifically. So my historic contribution to the WCA was actually to chair the 2006 National Conference in Boston, co-chair it. And then Kathy Halamka and I co-edited the book Blaze, Discourse on Art, Feminism, Art, Women, and Feminism, which really tracked the history of the WCA, but it was also a really important book that really invited artists, historians, art historians, curators, directors of museums to contribute text that really was about enlarging this shift from second wave to third wave generation of artists. So those conversations were sort of emphasized within this text, and it made a significant contribution. This presentation is about my journey as an artist. So I will present the long view, which is 35 years, but I will do it as highlighting. And it will shed light on how we understand memorial art as a cultural phenomenon. And it's really interesting to place memorial art within the context of culture. In many respects, it is easier to create public art about power and corruption under a dictatorship than it is to create public art aligned with democracy and pluralism, especially in times of change such as these. So one must ask, is it even possible to create memorial art that is free from ideological bias? Can truth be isolated as a static entity and preserved across generations, multiple generations? Is memorial art developed according to a fixed set of principles? Is that an outdated phenomenon? What are the lessons of memorial art? For example, if memorial art leads to genocide prevention, we have failed to learn these lessons, and yet there remains a need, a deep yearning for history to matter, and we ache for peace. I will review phases of my work in relation to memorial culture as a holding environment, looking for patterns, omissions, and repetitions. I will present temporary art in public space as performative memory, in contrast to monuments and memorials whose primary purpose is that of endurance. I will also include excerpts from my teaching to concretize some ideas and emphasize the astonishing instability of all things academic, especially this week when Trump claims and threatens to punish universities that defy standards of compliance regarding ethical concerns and civil rights liberties in relation to the very real presence of anti-Semitism on campuses in the US. So yes, there is evidence of anti-Semitism on campuses, as well as in children's libraries and book banning, and dare I say, even in the public office. But I must be clear at the outset of this presentation, placing anti-Semitism and free speech at odds with one another is deeply troubling. Jews, especially European Jews who once lived under a Nazi dictatorship, know only too well the essential protection of free speech. So my focus today is on public art and my development as a public memory artist. However, even in something as benign as a slide presentation, we must consider the cultural environment we live in and be alert to the moment. We must ask who made the art, what is their relationship to the history, who funded the work, who is the intended audience, who is included, who is excluded, where is the art located, why here, what is the history that frames the work, what is the symbolic nature of the materials used, how does and did the public receive the work, does the memorial attract vandalism? Does the state value and protect the work? What is the emotive experience? So those are the contextual questions. And now I'm just going to simply jump into the presentation. Any questions about what I've discussed so far? Okay. Uh-oh, my screen is paused. Wait, let me stop the slide share. This is weird. This happens sometimes. Okay, it could be that this is too big. So I have a lot of slides here, so I will do it this way. I think you can still basically see the presentation. Yeah? Okay. So this is actually the landscape of Jungfernhof, and this is the place where the memorial will be built in this area. This is a quote that I found many years ago. And I must admit, I am a creature of legacy, and I really do believe that we must leave something of who we are to the next generation. I graduated from Mass Art as an artist, as a painter, and then for a variety of reasons, I went into art therapy. And so I begin here with an image of work made by women who were survivors of incest and sexual abuse. And this was a population that I worked closely with. These are very dark images, very difficult images. But what I learned in leading these groups is how to work with issues of trauma and grief and how to hold conversations about these difficult histories where the victims were not heard and understood. I also at that time was still painting. And I enjoyed painting, mostly abstract work and work with color, watercolors. I was active in the WCA. I was exhibiting my work. And it was all kind of non-directed, non-specific, very abstract, very much prone to accident development. And frankly, I started to become bored. I started to wonder, why am I doing this? What do I really want to say or do? And I would go into galleries and I wouldn't understand what was on the walls. I felt like I was out of touch with some contemporary work, particularly conceptual work or installation work. And I started to feel like my voice was broken. And I went back to graduate school. And I think the metaphor of a broken voice is interesting in terms of how we address that. And there are times, I think in our lives where we make shifts professionally based on a variety of circumstances. At that time, I also made something that I called a voice cape. And I wore this in my defense of my dissertation, but it was really about voice. And it was about what do I want to say? Who is my audience? The kinds of questions that I was asking of myself as an artist. And again, I had moved out of painting and two-dimensional work into something that was much more three-dimensional. I came across this quote that I also liked at the time. I'm not sure I love it right now, but this notion of dreaming of something that is more social, more collaborative, and more real than art. And I think that was a yearning that I had, and that is still something that I feel very gratified about in terms of my work in public art. I'm going to show 5 different projects, and there's a lot of work in between all that, but I'm just going to highlight these 5 projects. And this was called Earth Wounds. And this was about a forest that was being demolished across the street from my house. And it was because the Andover Newton Theological School was going bankrupt, and they needed money. So they sold 26 acres of woodland, which was the last green space in Newton. And I made my first mourning shroud about the loss of these trees. And the mourning shroud as a concept has repeated itself in my work. And this had Kriya, which is a Jewish demonstration of mourning where you rip cloth. So there was other symbolism within this mourning shroud. It's been on exhibit all over the country, strangely. So it's interesting because my idea of a mourning shroud has developed in a different direction. I also used limbs from the trees in the forest, and I started to layer them with text and photographs and other layers of memory, wounds, bandages, and they became these complex surfaces that I planned to then wrap in the mourning shroud and bury in the earth. So this was a very sophisticated project. However, the Andover Newton Theological Seminary did not want to really work with me. They gave me space, but they didn't have any money to do much of anything else. Hebrew College moved onto the Hill. They did not want to be. What had happened is I received letters from my grandparents, from my cousin, about that my grandparents wrote to my father in exile after my aunt died, from my cousin in London. And the whole movement of this project shifted and started to include Holocaust memory. And that became a sensitive topic. And it meant that some people wanted to work with me and other people did not. These are pegs that I made to that would sort of outline the shape of the grave site that I was going to create to bury these limbs, but that never happened. Instead, I ended up working with a school, an elementary school down the street, and they were very enthusiastic and they wanted kids to learn about what happens when you cut down a forest. I got little seedlings from the mayor's office. We planted new trees. It was a very community-driven event. What's interesting is in teaching at Lesley, I was showing these slides and a student said, "Was this at Bowen School? My sister was a part of this, and I remember she came home and talked about it." So that was a kind of a lovely awakening of how much influence we have in the world, and we don't really know it at the time. So we wrote poems to the trees and buried them in the ground with these seeds and earthlings. A year later, I made what was called a banner installation of how all of these trees were cut down on the same date. And then kids actually imitated my banners with their own banners, and it became a very lovely and completed cycle of work. And these are the letters that I inherited that my grandparents wrote to my father, who was expelled from Vienna in 1938, a couple of months after Hitler came and annexed Austria into Greater Germany. And these letters became navigational tools for me to learn more about my family's history. So once I saw the relationship between these trees and how and the Holocaust, I started to see more imagery in the trees and how they were. The trunks of these trees cast on the hillside reminded me actually of bodies in Liepaja in Riga that were on the countryside. So I started to feel the sadness of these forsaken bodies. Um, then, about after I translated the letters, I spent the next 4 or 5 years working on something called the Exiled Memory Project, and that began. It was a layered dialogue between my experience of walking in Vienna and learning about the history of Vienna, um, layered with my grandparents' letters, and also with paintings about carnage. So in each panel, there's a little glimpse of sort of blood, um, so that the concept of genocide is present in some way symbolically in each of the panels. So this was about the trees on my father's street and the trees as witnesses. And actually, there's a whole movement of witness trees, of trees that witness trauma and wars. Um, these are the paintings that I made of genocide, and I would extract parts of these paintings and insert them in the panels. But it was enjoyable to be painting again. Um, and then this, I have 3 or 4 panels to show you. This is one about my father, and he grew up in the 9th District. This is about his expulsion from Vienna and his movement through Cuba, basically, and then eventually into the United States. And it was a harrowing journey for him. And it begins with his Heimatschein, which is his document of citizenship in Austria, and it ends with my own citizenship in Austria that I recovered in 2008. And my grandparents, these are the only pictures I have of them. These are passport pictures that they were to use as part of their own, rescue out of Vienna, which they never were able to use for a variety of reasons. This is an image of the Jungfernhof concentration camp, and I used the worthless form of money to demonstrate how much money interfered with my parents being able to leave Vienna in a timely fashion. So money is a criteria for escape, even in today's world. This is just images on the streets of Vienna that I randomly saw. I didn't read German, so I didn't know what people were saying, what the graffiti was saying on the streets. There wasn't much of it because Vienna is a very clean and proper society. So they have places where graffiti is flourishing and other places where it's not. But this was the feeling and the mood to the streets of Vienna that I was trying to capture. This is an image of being in the fall of along the Danube Canal, and it really was about the survivors in the last phase of life, as being able as spokespeople about this history. And it's hard to read here, but there's an image of my face that my son took within this, and that I am becoming the next generation that carries the story of this history. And there's more symbolism with some of the objects that I used. This is actually the last image from the series to share. This is about the letters that my father sent to the Red Cross, searching for his parents after the war ended. And of course, he got no information. The Red Cross was disorganized and also overwhelmed and reluctant to share information. So there are Bad Arolsen's files that were in the archives for many years and not even shared with the survivors of the Holocaust. But it is embedded with their faces and also in the landscape of Jungfernhof, and the kind of hopelessness and despair of not only not being able to rescue one's parents, but not knowing what happened to them. So this notion of the physicality of a grave is really an important concept for many survivors of war. I'm going to now move to the Vienna Project, which happened in 2013 and 14, and it happened on the streets of Vienna, and it was really intended to be a graffiti project, but it moved in lots of different directions. I worked very closely. I had 22 partnerships, and I worked very closely with Angewandte, which is an art school in Vienna, with many different wonderful artists. And we used the project axiom, what happens when we forget to remember, and turned it into it and used 9 different languages representing 7 different victim groups and the different immigrants that moved into that are currently living in Vienna. And sprayed 38 sites on the streets of Vienna representing the 7 different victim groups, and representing sites where crimes of murder and humiliation and rescue happened with these 7 different groups. So it was an incredibly complex project to research and to develop. And I forgot to mention that the Exiled Memory Project took place and was on exhibit at the University of Vienna commemorating 1970 anniversary of the Anschluss. This project commemorated the 1975 anniversary of the Anschluss, when Austria was incorporated into Greater Germany. These are the lists of the 7 different groups that I worked with and thought about and considered. And what you can see is the names of Jewish victims are overwhelming in relationship to other groups. But these groups are all incredibly relevant and important. Many have been overlooked and continue to be overlooked. The Roma and Sinti still don't have a memorial. The Jehovah's Witnesses, this was the first time they were memorialized. So there's a lot of sadness and loss and complexity with this list. It was also the first time that an artist included multiple victim groups. And I did it in a way where each group was honored, but I didn't generalize and I didn't lose the different identities. People felt like, well, everyone's equal once they're dead. There should be no distinctions. And I felt that since the criteria for murder was about distinctions, and it was important to remain and keep those distinctions active. Anyway, so we also did graffiti along the Danube Canal and did a lot of installations by artists, working with the Bill of Rights and other political concepts relevant to post-Holocaust history. And again, a lot of digital ideas and projections that happened on buildings. It was very animated, very engaging. And this is an example of the spraying on the streets. This is in front of the Parliament, and I always comment that I could never do this in front of the White House, but we have, in fact, moved along, and we've actually done some of this work on the streets in Washington, D.C. So at each of the sites we had, and this is the Jehovah's Witness site, and people gathered as we were spraying, and then there were different conversations that took place. We also had a map that we turned into a smartphone app, and the map was made from the letters of survivors, of victims rather, that survivors had from their families. So it was letters about wishing to escape and be saved from what was happening on the streets of Vienna, and then those letters became the streets on this map, and it was used in the smartphone app as a default map. And it's on a permanent exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Vienna. This is an example of the performance art that took place on the streets. And so at these 38 sites, there was a constant circling of performance artists that did work relevant to memory. So again, it was a way of animating the sites and creating a more interactive experience. I also created a reading marathon, and this was a huge project where I collected letters from all over the world, basically, and created packets representing the 7 different victim groups. I got 23 schools in Vienna to agree to participate. And in 1 hour, these groups were at a particular site reading letters, reading a whole packet of letters to audiences. It was incredibly moving, but it was also one instance of many where people said, "You can't do that. You're not going to be able to do that." And often when I start projects, that's what people say. No, you can't do that. No, that's too big. No, you don't have the capacity to do that. And then it happens. This is the closing image, and I have a short video that I can share with you of what it looked like. These are more than 88,000 names that were projected onto the walls surrounding Josefplatz. It's the first time, what Austria said to me for many years is, we don't like naming memorials. And so they absolutely, refused to let me do this. And then finally they thought, oh, okay, I guess, we're not at risk. And so it was allowed. And it was really the size and the enormity of this experience. And the concept of including multiple groups was very unusual. And these are the onlookers. And there is someone on this call who is in this photo wearing a red sweater. This was a circle of people that brought letters from families that they shared in this group. People were invited to do that. So as the pictures of names were being projected onto the walls, this group was reading letters from the victims whose names were projected onto the walls. So it was a very complicated and highly orchestrated event. So this is a short video. And you can let me know if you want me to skip it or whether it's of interest.
Yes, you should go ahead.
I should go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Karen Frostig. I am the artist who conceived the Vienna Project, which we are open.
Okay. So that would just review what I've just really said. This is a poster that I made. And what's interesting about this poster was at this point in time, I created these kinds of conclusions about public memory and what I thought were truisms, that these were things that public memory in the 21st century needed to consider. And they still hold up in my mind, that they're still very important. I mean, I think we can understand that the cultural heritage of Holocaust art has also changed over time. And it started very concretely with images of despair and sadness, and also of using artifacts like the ovens to speak to the history. But we're now, again, with the distance to the events themselves, how do we create a contemporary experience where we emphasize participation and dialogue in multiple perspectives? And that really changes how we understand history and the fixation of history. So this is actually the last of the series of projects. This is going into Jungfernhof in Latvia, and this was in 2007. And I was, I had a guide to show me. We couldn't even, not many people even knew where this camp was. Very few people knew it even existed. So it was extremely isolated and rather terrifying to me. When we got to the gates, there was a pile of garbage, which was kind of, perhaps indicative of the attitude that people had about this memory. And everything was overgrown. And it was a wild place. And unlike working in Vienna, where everything is so refined and urban, clean, this was the opposite. This was rough. This was abandoned. This was very much about a contact with the earth. And it was also looking at the kind of refuse that the camp held, that it was really a place of trash. And I came back. This is actually an event that happened on March 26, 1942, which we're coming up to that anniversary date, where 1,800 to 2,000 victims were taken on buses to the Birkeniki forest and shot into mass graves. So this is the forest. And there are some small signs, but it's lacking adequate signage even to this day. And the victims were told, we're going to relocate you to a small fishing village, and there are hospitals and schools and restaurants, and you're going to be taken care of. But instead, they brought them to this site and they were murdered. And that is not unusual for how the kinds of deception that was used to placate Jews as they rounded them up for murder. This is the fishing village where they were going to be taken. There is obviously nothing there. That was fiction. And I came back in 2010. This is all in 2007. I came back in 2010 to present a memorial. I, at that point, felt very inspired to create a memorial at the camp. I was told the camp was too remote, there was no money, and there was really not a kind of infrastructure to build a memorial at the camp. So they said, thank you very much. But that did not proceed. I, at that time, at that point, went back to Vienna and did the Vienna Project. And then when that concluded and it was clear that the right-wing government was going to now take that work and do something in a different direction, I came back to Riga. And in 2019, I returned and I created a new set of proposals for a memorial in Riga. And these too were rejected. And they were rejected because I was told, well, you won't recognize the camp because we've kind of cleaned it up and, we've gotten rid of all the trash and it really doesn't look like it looked in 2010. And so this is an image. I don't know if that moves. It should move. Yes. So you can see that it's just a kind of gorgeous site. And no, it doesn't look like a camp. It does look like a recreation park, which is what it now is. So it's for recreation, for sports, for ice skating, and they're hoping to develop it with an atrium for music. So they really didn't quite have a location in mind for a memorial. The other issue, and you can see how this looks. So 4,000 people were on this land. So I started then with what would be a virtual memorial project, which is basically a very big website. And we started with the deportation listings. And Richard Splavnik's, I think, is on this call, and he was the chief historian that I worked with. We worked with a team of 4 historians, including Ilya Lenski. And the first thing that I was told when I asked to do a memorial at Jungfernhof is they said, well, there's this history of a mass grave, and, really, you first have to find the mass grave. And I thought, how am I going to find a mass grave? So it turns out that Shula Reinhardt is a friend. She introduced me to a woman named Paula Apsel, who introduced me to a man named Richard Freund, who was the chief Holocaust archaeologist in the world. And he was working in Lithuania. And he was interested in the project and said, sure, I will work with you on that. So all of a sudden, what seemed impossible was now starting to become possible. So on the website, for instance, we have the listing of all the people where they lived. That has never been made available to people. I mean, it is, if you dig around, you can find it on the archives, but here it is just available at this point and organized. This is a welcoming sign at the camp itself, which I found it incredibly offensive. It's very much about the manner history that preceded the Holocaust, with flowers and butterflies, and no mention or reference to a mass grave or to a Holocaust at the site. One can imagine that it would be very difficult to include a mass grave on this beautiful mural. There was also a sign at the camp that described the history, 800 years of history on the land. And there was one sentence that was devoted to the concentration camp, but it really was misleading. It looked at the site as working in agriculture. So it really did not talk about prisoners and murder and a hanging and a mass grave. I mean, all of that was somehow bleached from the text. But now that we're moving toward a memorial, I found this very frustrating at one point in the development of this project, and now I've moved beyond it. So this is a descendant group that I established in, I think it was 2021 or 2, and it's been meeting for about 4 or 5 years, continues to meet, and it's now about 70 people. I made an heirloom objects page, which these are stories about objects that families have inherited that come from someone at the camp. So they're touched by some history to the camp itself. Newsletters. This is a 1-minute film. Let me see if I can get that going. That just provides you an overview. And Richards was instrumental in organizing this film, which is the full film is 20 minutes. This is 1 minute. I'm going to go to the next. Someone named Cindy Retteria raises her hand. Should we have questions at this point?
Idelle also has her hand up.
If you have other things to present, I think we should do questions later.
Okay. Is that
It's up to
okay?
you,
Cindy?
Karen.
What I can do, I have a few more slides, and then we can pause and take some questions, and then if you want to see more slides, we can do it that way too.
That
Okay,
sounds good.
that sounds good.
Okay. So I just want to take a minute to also show the scientific contribution to the project, and that curiously, even though we're looking underground, we use the sky, we use drones, we use maps, Google Maps, that indicate variations on the surface of the ground. So These were the scientists that we worked closely with, and this is called electric resistivity tomography. It's a very interesting process. It looks almost like lawnmowers covering the ground, but they're really using radio waves to look for irregularities in the ground and to look for handmade shapes that indicate the presence of some human interference with nature. And then things are pursued further. So we spent a lot of time looking and not finding the mass grave. We also then looked at all of the satellite sites of imprisonment and murder in Riga around the camp. And most of them interacted with this camp. And we created a 3D tour, which still works and has lots of information. So it's an interactive map and timeline that really tracks what happened in the 4 years that this camp existed. And Fred Zimick made almost a day-by-day calendar of what happened and how we went from 4,000 or 3,985 prisoners to the 149 survivors. This was a wonderful essay written by Richard Splavniks about Rudolf Seck, who was the commandant of the camp. I look at his picture and I am just shocked and reactive to it. But it's a very powerful essay that really describes the trial and how he was convicted of crimes against humanity and sent to life imprisonment in a jail in Germany and then released early. These are timelines that we made about the camp. These are audio tapes of research that was then put onto a tape, and that is downloaded as a sound description of what took place. And these are on different topics. Very, very interesting to listen to. And what this is a plan to project the deportation videos and images that I had onto the Shkiratava train station where Jews had to come to before they were sent to the camps. And that train station received 30,000 Jewish prisoners over 2 or 3 years. I was not allowed to use the train station. And then I was invited by Ambassador oh God, I have his name, Paldagovich, from Latvia to speak at the General Assembly at the UN. And that became a turning point in terms of my work and the reach of my work. And it was also published in the New York Times. But what was important about that event was also that he was able to include the ambassadors from Germany, Austria, and the US to sponsor me, to co-sponsor me, to come to the UN. So all of a sudden now we had a kind of cooperation from all of these countries who were very influential in the history of the camp. While I was at the UN, Ilya, who is the director of the Jewish Museum in Latvia, was at the Corner House, which is now a museum of the KJP's headquarters and how their imprisonment of Latvians before they were deported to Siberia. So what is important about this short video, and I'll only show about a minute, is that it was the first time these two histories of genocide, one from Germans to Jews and the other from Soviet Union occupying Latvia and deporting Latvians to Siberia. So this is the first time that these two histories have come together. And that's a breakthrough.
So for us, it is very important that today on the Holocaust Victims Commemoration Day, when the story of Jungfernhof is told in the UN and is very much brought to light and brought to international attention, this presentation can be seen also in the Occupation Museum, in the so-called Corner House, former KGB headquarters. And we're extremely grateful to our colleagues from the Occupation Museum with whom we have long story of friendship and cooperation, that they also joined us in this effort. And we really consider the story of deportations from Germany, Austria, Czechia, Hungary, and particularly the story of those almost 4,000 people who ended up imprisoned in Jungfernhof, many of whom perished there or were killed in Bitternecke forest, to be an integral part of history of Latvia under occupations. So it is another, we could say, beautiful continuation of our cooperation. And we hope that the story of Jungfernhof will become better known, will become more included also in the cityscape of Riga when memorial sign will be installed and the memory of the victims will be properly commemorated.
Going to keep going. But that was a major breakthrough historically. There's one more project to squeeze in, which is about the Day of Remembrance, which took place at Brandeis University just last spring. And this was really an international project as well, where there were, I'm trying to remember how many, it seems there were many speakers from different parts of the country, but also in terms of, so it began with Danielle Legros George's poetry about deportations. And so we had an evening to look at the deportations that I was not able to project onto the Shkeretava train station. What I did is I turned this very large room that I was given to work in into an immersive experience. And we had 6 projectors and small groups sitting in front of the videos of the deportations, having conversations about deportation, not necessarily specific to this camp, but in other situations in the world. This is a tiny short video, 1 minute of that. I'm just going to move on.
Erin, just so you know, there was a comment that when you play the videos, we see the images but no sound. It's not that significant. We're fine, I think, without that, but just.
Yeah, no, that's important. I wonder, I think it has to do with whether I can upload. Let me see if this will, let me just finish this slide presentation. There's only one more video to share. And then we can see if that happens in the next presentation. I can try it, but I doubt it will. Yeah, I have no idea what's going on. So this is an image of the mourning shroud. And you can see now how different it is from the mourning shroud I made about the forest years ago. So this includes the names of all the victims. It also includes fauna from Riga around the border. And there is a poem, What Happens When We Forget to Remember. 149 survivors are not included in this image. And this image became a focal point of this Day of Remembrance, and that people became very involved in this. And there is a short video to share of what that looks like. We went from gathering around it and having prayers and songs, to going outside and creating a public procession of this mourning shroud. Can you hear that? No?
No.
I've been in other Zooms where we
We
could,
arrived at a small train station.
there, yes.
Yes,
Surrounded by
You can hear
all
that?
white.
yes.
When I got off the train, it seemed as if we were enclosed by walls of snow. And the road was also a dirty white. Things that we have to do is think about that the past, which is always with us, be an anchor or a beacon. It was that search that I hope we can all continue.
Here to honor the memory of my grandparents, Arthur and Carolina Stern, and my father,
My
Samuel.
father was Leonard Simak, a survivor of Jungfernwald.
Remembering my grandfather, Abraham Wolf.
Grandmother, Bella Samuel.
And also Margot Haas.
My great grandfather.
Sebby Haas is my great from my great aunt from Hamburg. Her name was Harriet.
Great grandmother Marguerite Wartowski is on the list here.
Max Koenigsberg, great grandparents, my dad's grandparents, and uncle were up there. So it's Ignace Carnier, a survivor.
Two of my great uncles listed on the list.
Sister Ilsa.
Jakob and Siegfried Steinberger.
Because if you don't remember their name, it's as if they died a second time.
My name is Peter Stern, and I am one of the 149. Was there and was able to leave. My life, I've been able to use light as can the anchor, as a steadying, something to remember, not to hold you back.
A few more slides to just complete the story. So between the UN presentation and the Day of Remembrance, we really I moved the project forward a great deal. And it's now at the stage now we are going to create a memorial at the site, which is hard to believe. I'm not sure exactly where the money is coming from, but it will eventually appear. But that is now in process, and that is a breakthrough. And there was an important article in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which was syndicated to a bunch of different newspapers, that really told the story of this forgotten camp. And it no longer is an unknown camp. It's now a known camp. People are really surprised that 3 miles outside of the Riga's capital city, of Latvia's capital city of Riga, that this camp is not known, not identified, not memorialized. And so that is going to change. And actually, a very big change took place this past July in 2024. Our 2 scientists working with students discovered the foundational stones of the barracks that were built by Jews. It was sometime after 1942. So what that means is that we now have, we still don't have the mass grave, but we have actual evidence that this camp existed. And so we have maps to compare it to and locate that this was in fact the barracks foundation, so that the memorial will be located in this actual place. And we have rocks. And I was so emotional to see these rocks because there are no photographs of Riga. There are no, sustaining and remaining documents of any kind. So this is the first time we have evidence that this camp in fact existed, and these rocks will be part of a memorial project. And the memorial will take place and be located in this area where the barracks are located. And if you look at this map, here is a map of the camp and the park, but the barracks are off to the side. And so it turns out that the barracks are located in a bit of a problematic setting. And this is, I believe, the last slide. So what you have here is what the park looks like. There's the promenade, there's a volleyball area, there's the park's history, there's ice skating in the winter. There are people that live in the developed land that have farms and gardens. And this is where the barracks is. And the barracks is actually not in the camp. It's located in a part of the area zoned for housing. So the housing is not built there yet, but at some point we will share the environment with other Latvians. And will that be good? Will that not be good? I think it will be good. I think we will see what it's like to create a memorial and be responsive to the people that live there and also involve them in the experience of remembering this camp. And we may still yet find the mass grave. That's still something we hope to do. I'm going to stop the slide sharing now so we can evaluate your questions and consider whether you want to see more slides or, what it is that you would like to do. But this is kind of a very dense, quick overview of the project or the series of projects.
Thank you so much. I just put in the chat that you can put your questions in the chat and we'll read those off as they come, as we get them. Anyone have any questions? Just regarding the science, remember reading that you used LiDAR in looking for some of the location of the barracks or some kind of imaging.
Yeah, so it's ERT technology.
Oh, ERT.
And I can't quite describe, I mean, I have been able to describe it in earlier times. It's using wires and batteries from cars. I mean, it's very kind of basic, primitive tools and equipment. And that there's an echo of radio waves that indicate voids and spaces, and that those voids then become places that you can investigate. There is an expectation. There used to be without this kind of equipment that you couldn't confirm a grave unless you opened it, unless you found out what was in the grave. And now there's really a trend where you don't disturb the interior of a grave site. That this notion. And this is a concept for the memorial. Is it a final resting place? When you're murdered, when you die in a way that is not conducive to a long evolution of sorts, is a resting place? Is that the correct language to use? But that is what happens. We do go into the ground.
Thank you. There's a question, if you've considered using augmented reality in any of your projects?
Yes. When I mentioned that there were a bunch of projects that I started before I went back to Riga in Austria, I was imagining a memorial that would use augmented reality. So there was some experimentation with that. I think that we're going to see more augmented reality. But I think also what has happened, I don't know if other people experience this in museums, that COVID interrupted, how museums would share equipment, and that there are long lines for these augmented reality experiences so that they don't accommodate large groups. But they're interesting and they're exciting. And I think there's another short slide presentation of this concept of methodologies. How do artists create methodologies that invite participation is another important aspect of memorial development.
Karen, can I just ask a question? Because on the augmented reality question, my thought was using augmented reality on the street for memorials, in certain locations where you're not able to put a physical memorial, where people access it through their cell phone. It doesn't have to be a museum experience.
Yeah.
Although it requires good
Wi-Fi.
Right. So that might be a limiting factor, but that may change over time. So that's why I wanted to throw that out. Your work is so powerful, and people can discover it long after your slide experience or whatever in that place. They can listen to the stories that people read, that sort of thing. But it requires signage and good Wi-Fi or good.
Yeah. It's also very expensive. I mean, we did an app for Vienna.
Okay.
And I don't think it still works, but it was expensive to maintain it. Then you've got to keep upkeep, the upkeep has to be continuous. So it's a long-term investment and involvement. I think in some ways that this new technology is going to change history and change the history books, because we're going to discover graves that exist where we don't want them to exist. And do we want to live with that much history? And I'm not sure we do, or whether we actually need to. I think there's some question that, in fact, we've overlooked too many groups. And this would be a way of tracking that history more effectively. So there's arguments in both directions, but no one wants to learn that there's a mass grave in the basement of their house. So it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's intrusive. And expensive.
Okay. I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Someone has commented, that's from Lydia Kahn. There are some parallels with the camp at Gurs, France, which was reforested after it closed down, and then a group of survivors pushed for a memorial to be created there with barrack recreations, walkways, and signage. And she did an installation about this at the WSRC Gallery in 2020, 2013.
Yeah.
And someone else is asking what happened to the final shroud. That's from Rona. What the final shroud project you showed at the Brandeis Memorial?
So that's a very good question. It has been a grueling experience to raise money. And if you look at the news, does Europe have an appetite to pay for memorial funding? Also, when you apply for grants, if you're applying locally for grants, it's got to appeal to the local audiences. So if you're doing something in Riga, but you're living in Boston, how does that work? Why would they fund a project in Riga if it's for Boston audiences? So I did, at the Day of Remembrance, I did broaden the focus of the conversation to include other grave sites that had not been properly acknowledged or memorialized, including at the Fernald State Hospital, where there is an incredible grave site that is anonymous, without names. So that, and also Native American graves that are in the area. So I pursued a little bit with the Fernald. I might do that additionally. The memorial, right now, the mourning shroud is, rolled up safely in an area in my basement for storing art. We are going to have a groundbreaking ceremony in Riga. I'm not sure if it's this summer or next. And we will bring that to the ceremony. The issue is that I still would like to see embroidery along the border. So it's not complete yet. And so I need another $10,000 to do that. And so who is going to give me $10,000 to finish embroidery for a camp in Latvia? They might contribute to memorial, but I'm not sure this will attract proper funding. That's something I hope for. Because I think I've written a lot about the memorial, the mourning shroud, and I do believe that we're living in an era where we're dealing with many different graves, multiple graves all over the world. And we don't know how to really prepare for mass graves and burials. And this becomes a different kind of solution, a different kind of caring that is for families, but also is really a kind of comforting and blanket on the earth, kind of transitional object from living to dying. So I am still interested in pursuing this, and I do think it will have an additional audience.
You mentioned Native American grave sites, and Mindy Nierenberg asked, have you seen the documentary Sugar Cane? It's a story of the Native Americans from a reservation use science and persistence to locate children secretly buried on the grounds of a Catholic boarding school. She put the link in the chat. If you want to copy that.
Wonderful. I do teach a lecture on Native Americans, and there is a boarding school. I mean, there are lots of boarding schools, including at Harvard University, missionary schools. But there was one in particular in Canada where they had graves around the school itself, and that is part of the difficult history, even at the Fernald School, where they had a lot of sterilization, presumably some babies maybe aborted, who knows. So what is on the grounds of these institutions and around these institutions? And how another real question is, how do we take history that happened in a remote place so many years ago and square it with today's history? And is it relevant? Does memory work? Is our memorials, they're expensive. And how do they interact with contemporary history, particularly today in the Middle East and in Ukraine? How do you create those intersections? And how do you do it in a way that is instructive and not reactive? That's sort of the big question in the world.
Yes, I'm concerned with, this is Idelle, it's my question. I'm concerned with the use of anti-Semitism, sort of weaponizing it in the way schools are being made to capitulate right now. And I realize that other people may have other views, but I'm very concerned about I think he said something, and I don't have it was like an equation of being able to have justice and being able to be free speech to be able to happen. And with the shutting down of DEI, and we're seeing that at University of Michigan, we've seen what's happening in Columbia. I'm just wondering how that comes up with your students right now or in your practice. Thank you.
So I do try to create conversations that are contemporary, and I do have like 4 slides to show you of something that happened in Cambridge that's kind of an interesting problem that really addresses that question directly. Do you want to see there were 4 slides? I don't know. Would you like to see them? Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
It's kind of shocking. So, and I'd be interested in your reactions. Okay, let's see if this will allow me to do it. Okay. So I don't know if you can see this image. So I was in a class teaching a course called, I want to move this other thing aside, but I can't seem to, anyway. Teaching a class about art activism in the community. And a student looked out and she said, well, you've seen this sign, haven't you? And I said, what sign? And I didn't know what she was talking about. So you can see, maybe, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, my photos are in the way, but there are 2 billboards facing each other, which is kind of interesting. So I will show you the next slide, which tells you what it looks like.
Can you see anything?
You couldn't see anything? Can everyone see that slide?
Radicals
I can
ruin
see it.
America. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I asked, yeah. I asked students what they thought, who was this sign for? This is in Porter Square in close to Harvard Square, and it's on Mass Ave, very prominent. You can see that it was funded by JewBelong.org. I don't know what that organization is. And I wondered who the audience was, whether it was Leslie or Harvard, because both institutions are on that street. So students thought it was for Harvard because they had a greater incidence of anti-Semitism. And then I suggested that maybe we use the other billboard and create a public dialogue. I mean, it was just sort of almost handed to us. And so I said, well, what would we write? What would be 3 words that we could say to respond to the sign that is not a kind of blaming dialogue, but a dialogue that would really engage people in a conversation. So one student said, what's to ruin? So everyone thought that was a kind of cute response. But I think what's happened in recent days is that, in fact, this is a deeply troubling question. Who is this about? And what is happening at Columbia, and how does that affect universities? So I went back to take a photograph of this for this presentation, and also to take a photograph of the other billboard, which is really very close to it. And this is The Radicals Ruin America. And lo and behold, they put up a response. So it's the same group, because what was on that billboard 2 weeks ago was just some kind of bland advertisement for an academic program. And now there's this sentence as a response. And so I'm curious how people think about this sentence as compared to the other sentence and the kind of dialogue that's being initiated here. Any thoughts? I found the other sentence very accusatory, and I wasn't sure what was being said. Whereas this sentence feels a little more clearly acknowledging anti-Semitism, and that we must address it and stand with any kind of racism and anti-Semitism that is happening in our institutions. Any other thoughts?
Well, the other sign, radicals, as somebody asked in the comments, is like, who are they? Do they mean by the radicals? And I'm assuming they mean the ones that are putting out anti-Semitic messages. But it's a very difficult term to use, the term radical.
Susan?
Mm-hmm. So, and it's become more complicated and more layered as a question. With Mahmoud Khalil's arrest, who was a person who was accused of leading the pro-Palestinian encampments at Columbia. But it has now become a debate between anti-Semitism and free speech. And that takes it to a very different level, and really complicates how we respond.
If you remember, the that issue came up not in the same way, but in the Skokie, where the ACLU lost a lot of Jewish contributions because they stood behind the Nazi march in Skokie as being free speech. And this is a really it's coming up again in this way.
Yep.
Where do you draw the line between
Yeah.
hate, something that can become more than just free speech and produce something violent, and free speech?
Yeah.
I just finished watching Mo, on
Mo's great.
Netflix. Yeah, I think it's on Netflix, which is
Mhm.
the second season is very much about his return to Palestine and to the West Bank to family. And it's, if you don't know, Mo is a comedian from Houston, and he has a 2-season show that Netflix produced. And in some ways, I might have found that offensive, but I didn't, because I know the reality. If you don't know the reality, you're going to feel that this is anti-Semitic.
Right.
You know.
Right. So the question is, at this point, we're really looking at trying to protect our rights as free citizens, and that becomes, these are the things that are at major risk. And so we need to maybe be a little uncomfortable while we focus on how we protect the bigger issues. There's one thing that I added to this, which is this poem that you must all know, which is relevant here.
Yes.
You know, how do we embrace and protect people that are being marginalized for whatever reasons?
Well, it's called empathy. It's called stepping outside of yourself and not being always self-motivated, and understanding that we all live here in society together.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm the child of 2 survivors, and I have no family. You're very fortunate to know so much about your family. I know nothing really about my family, and it's all gone. And it's really difficult and hard sometimes to not really be able to understand all of that, and sort of what does it mean for those of us who are descendants and carry that PTSD that lived in our families and lived with the horrors of what they lived through and would never talk about.
Yep.
And I've tried through my art, I've tried through my poetry, and it's always troublesome, and people do not want to see it, and they don't want to hear it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you know, working with historians and scientists for 5 years, and making a website that's so full of information, that I get so many letters of thank you because people knew nothing. And now there is this skeleton. It's not as much as we would like because so much was destroyed. But this notion of not knowing, of carrying this history. I was surprised when I was teaching a class 2 semesters ago or a semester ago, when students were really intensely defending the Palestinian cause. And I didn't realize how affected I was by October 7th, and how traumatized I was by that, and how I could not, that I really insisted that Israel, has a right to exist. There's a history. But actually the students were really in pain about their own feelings of justice being misunderstood. And so it required a bigger heart to be able to create a safe space for all of these difficult feelings.
It's a very difficult and very complex and old history that is not easily answered to. And because that's something that I have looked at as well. We are displaced persons. I was born in a displaced persons camp.
Wow.
My parents tried to immigrate. They were turned back from the borders. I have no home in that sense either, except what I make for myself.
Yeah.
And so how does that make my suffering or what I carry any different from someone else's or any less than someone else's because I'm a white woman who's in her 70s? Fuck that. Excuse me, but
Yeah. I mean, I was interested in the last class that I taught that, I assign these projects that people do, and they all decided to work on this concept of home in different contexts. But I think we are all feeling so fundamentally threatened in some ways. And this safety of home and where we can go to feel safe.
I have another issue also with the fact that after October 7th, and you realize that all the people that were acknowledging what happened on October 7th were the right-wing Republicans. And so I can imagine that students or young people who are socialists or who are thinking in an more advanced intellectual way, if they see that Trump and his cronies are pro-Israel, then they think there must be something wrong with that. I should be on the opposite side of that, because why would I agree with Trump and the Republicans? And so that makes it even more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I would add that many of these kids grew up in the time of Netanyahu, and their visibility is to the activities of the West Bank. And that's their vision of Israel. And that's really sad. That's the situation, right?
Yeah, the male autocrats that are using their personal corruption to be protected so that they can do whatever they need to distract from their own issues. I mean, I don't think we've ever been in this kind of global crisis before. Well, we have. World War II was that. But this is where we're really now at the pressure point of all of these things coming together. And it is shocking that Colombia capitulated to Trump. But that was a lot of money that they were going to lose. But this is not going to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, American history is being rewritten. There's so much that's being, and we're seen as radicals.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, maybe we should
Very
do
layered.
more slides. Maybe we should just be able to see people as they speak.
Yeah, and I have one more question about what you've shown so far. How are the people in Riga feeling about the project?
Excellent question.
Considering what we just discussed, and the changes in how people are all over the world have moved to the right.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I don't have an answer for you. And there's a few reasons why. So I've been working on this since 2019, and I've probably gone to Riga, 7 or 8 times, which is, when I was doing the Vienna Project, I was there every 3 months. I had a place to stay in Vienna, and I went broke using my own money, and I refuse to now underwrite this work. I work for free. I'm not going to pay my plane fare to go to Riga. And if you don't have face-to-face conversations, you can't establish a relationship. So even though this is post-COVID and we have a lot more tolerance for Zoom, and I can get work done long distance, it's different than actually being there. So I've talked with Ilya about this and about, and I don't know if Richard Plavniks is still on the call. I thought there were 9,000 Jews in Riga. And I just read on internet that there were 4,000. So I don't know if it's 9,000 unaffiliated, but 4,000 is a very small number. I don't know if that's correct. But many of the Jews in Riga are Russian Jews. And Riga is also a very small country. And it's a very poor country. It's very green, very lush. It's in Northern Europe, but it's very poor. They just received $4 million of restitution funds from the city of Latvia, from the parliament of Latvia, which is a lot of money that is going to be distributed over 4 years. But actually, they have so much that they need to spend money on for Jewish infrastructure. There's very little for memorial development, but they are now in a different position where they have power and they have some money. Latvia, I am told, there are some hardcore, Russia is threatening to invade Latvia again. So that's not something that they can walk away from and not be worried about. So the question is that I was told that Latvians are not anti-Semitic, they're just disinterested. And they're so happy to be living in Latvia and not Russia. So there's a way that they don't want me to disrupt things. It's fine that I want to make a memorial in Jungfernhof, but it's not like people in Latvia go on the streets and protest. Latvia also, I must say, we now have a different outlook from our own government, but the government of Latvia was quite unstable in my experience. So I would go there and I'd be expecting to meet with the mayor. Oh, well, the mayor was just transferred or he just lost his job, or, there's a constant turnover and instability of workers. I was just told recently, well, they had a Holocaust education program, but that woman was transferred to a different position. What do you mean? Do you still have a Holocaust program? So there are all of these things that happen. Even the mural that no one responded to. That I was upset, but other people were not. So it's a very different climate culturally from this country. I don't know if that answers your questions. So I haven't been back and forth enough to build a lot of relationships. I have some, but it's hard to know how to involve Latvians in this project and how to involve descendants. It's not necessarily how you want to spend your Sunday afternoon. And fundraising is not also fun, although it can be. But yeah. People are really appreciative of the work that I've done, but I'm not sure people want to be involved in doing the work with me.
How did you get so many people involved in the project in Vienna that you had so many different layers, so many different colleagues involved?
Yeah, this is a very different experience. So, Vienna had a memory infrastructure. I don't know if you're aware that Ron Lauder invested a tremendous amount of money in Vienna as well as in
Budapest.
Budapest, thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Budapest, the whole reconstruction of that synagogue.
Yeah.
Which is gorgeous. It's
gorgeous.
beautiful synagogue.
Yeah, so, that
has
money
that-
came from Ron Lauder. And in fact, a lot of memorial money comes from the US, except Germany. Germany has been outstanding as a support of this kind of work. It's really the only country that has supported it to the extent that it has. And it's the only country that tells the truth about its history. But that may be changing because the AFD is, their government is changing also.
Well, what about Poland?
What about it? What's your question?
Like, what have they done to address their history?
I assume there are different parts of the country that have done more than other parts. So Krakow and Warsaw, I think, are more active in creating museums and really trying to tell and retell this history. It's complicated because we're talking about Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe was occupied by Russians. And so from some standpoints, people feel like, the Germans were better to them than the Russians. And that's very difficult to understand why they would think that, but they were occupied by Russians for so many years. And I think that kind of culture, the Russian culture, is a culture of closeness, and people are suspicious and protective. So it's a very different kind of culture, really, to work with. It's very different from this culture. We've become very polarized, but basically it's a fairly open culture.
Hard to ask victims to remember other victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So much of the world is filled with traumatic histories.
Yeah.
I'm curious whether
Can you
you're.
identify who you are, please, when you speak?
This is Wendy Lowengrove. Sorry. I'm curious whether your experience in Latvia with sort of the instability there is going to sort of inform some of the work that will help us inform some of the work that we see coming in the future. Like, we're artists, we need to hold these memories, we need to produce work, we need to do this. But things will be unstable, maybe not yet at the it's going to be very unstable at the nonprofit level. So is there any learnings other than it's really difficult to work on the Sunday, anything that you can talk about that you've learned that could sort of help us with these challenges that we see coming?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how to describe the passion to do this work. It's very draining. I'm not paid. It's depleting. And there's a clock ticking, so my mortality is clicking as well. Second generation and third generation, these are different, so what's the distance to the history, and how do you capture it? So clearly, I think even in the Day of Remembrance, I've always sort of gravitated toward working in groups. And it's really hard to fund those kind of projects, to organize the groups. It's very, very taxing. So when I teach this, I actually have a lot of, assistance for students, guidelines for them to use.
The only things we have are in the cabinets or underneath the.
Please mute yourself.
So you have to have, anyway, to answer your question, Wendy, you have to have a lot of energy and a lot of belief.
Yeah.
In the importance of the work. And you have to find allies to work with. And one group becomes another group. You can't do it alone. Although it's hard to work with different groups of people.
This is Idelle. When you were talking about the deportations, I was, thinking of the people right now who are being deported and how there's actually some people who are documenting things as they happen in real time. Like there's a law professor at the U of M who's documenting all the different legal cases that are happening and just archiving these things and responding in real time is hard because where will it go? Where can you get it in front of people? And, will people remember that that's what was happening? So I guess I'm just grappling with the reality right now and what's being done to some people and not to others. And how do we as artists, even amplify it or at least record it in some kind of meaningful way?
And that's expensive. Making videos is expensive and having them edited. And when you make art, and where do you store it? All of that stuff and what materials. I mean, it somehow people think it's for free, but it isn't. It's really, really hard.
Before we lose any more people, do people want to see the other slides or the other that you were going to put up? I see some yeses because I know people have had to leave. Is that yes from most people?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm getting yeses.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not many. Like you can see them right here. There are many. I'll just go through a few of them.
Okay.
And then we'll just stop. I'll check and I'll say, should we stop
And
now?
if anybody wants to stay and, then we can take it from there. But I don't want to keep people, I don't know. I think we were scheduled for another 10 minutes or so. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if you can see this.
Yes.
Now it's working. Okay. So this is, so I often start a class just talking about different forms of governance. People don't know. This is, basic civic education that students don't know about. And I started to do this, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago when I was working on the Vienna Project. And I was aware of fascism. And I talked about fascism. And people, why do you talk about fascism? We live in a democracy. But, you need to know these things. So we start with these conversations. I also try to find art that gives a lightness to the work and that has a different way of communicating the issues that I'm discussing. And I found this artist's work very interesting, that these rights are unraveling.
Yeah.
And I start with the Constitution, and that actually democracy is about lawfulness. Fascism is about lawlessness. So when I was doing that project in Vienna, the Exiled Memory Project at the University of Vienna's law school, they said, well, we didn't really have curriculum for the Holocaust because that was an era of lawlessness. Well, that was a good way to justify not having curriculum for the Holocaust. But, it is important to understand when you go on the news how much legal matters are being discussed, because that's the way to push back, that democracy is about lawfulness. So I, do this to remind people, this is the language that we use. Is this how we're living? How does this jive with today's world?
No.
This is from Timothy Snyder. These are his ideas about freedom is about knowing what we value. And that, it's not something that happens in isolation. And that, he really is a spokesperson for freedom. I don't know if some of the words are cut off. I don't know if you can see everything. Am I going too fast? Is this okay?
Okay.
So he, suggests these 5 ideas about freedom. He's trying to give people tools to fight back in this world. I'm going to keep going. Is that okay?
Yes.
So I do things, I try to make visual images of, Bill of Rights. This is, this is how we live our lives. We have these laws and rules that we abide by. And that's democracy. And democracy is imperfect, but it also seems to be the best form of governance so far. But we might be living in a post-democracy era. And then what? And this is, another version of rights where it's much more unraveled. And you can see this on the internet somewhere where it's in motion, but I wasn't able to download it that way. So methodologies, I give these students lists of methodologies. These are the methodologies I used in the Vienna Project. And, I don't know how I had the energy to do all this and to come up with these ideas, but it was a way of creating variety and making a project that would be participatory, because I believe that if people are passive and they use consumer attitudes to understand memory, they're not going to get it and they're not going to really benefit from that.
Oh, that's interesting.
This is the Vienna Project. And now this is the Lock of Memory Project. This is a whole different set of methodologies. I didn't even know what methodologies meant, but what I do is I create new methodologies that are interesting and that are that invite participation, and that there's a lot of variety. When I did the Day of Remembrance, faculty at Brandeis said, "Well, why don't you just just keep it the panel? That's it, and don't do anything more." I said, "No, I'm not doing the panel. I'm an artist," and the art was the most engaging part of the whole program. So it's artists that think like this, and that's exciting. This is when I'm writing grants. I think this was for the website. These are again different methodologies, and this is helpful to students. Oh, I could do this, or I could do this. This is for the Mourning Shroud. And, again, it's a different set of methodologies. These are images about public art. Should I keep going or not?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Russian images of busts of public art. A lot of public art is markers. You get a stone and you stick a name on it, and that's, you've done the work. But that lacks agency. There's no creativity, there's no imagination, there's no narrative. So it's a poor representation of memory. One of the most extraordinary memorials in the world that changed the history of memory art is the Vietnam Memorial, Maya Lin's memorial. And it's extraordinary. And it really was almost like a wound in the land. And it was also the first memorial that was really built kind of partially underground. So you had the sense of burial. And that it was names, you could touch the names, but you could see your reflection. It became interactive because you could see yourself in the environment.
I remember there was controversy over that because it was not the standard memorial with a statue or statues.
So I'll show you that controversy. Yes, I completely agree. So, but this is by far one of the most powerful memorials in the country. And people leave artifacts, and that there's now a museum that collects the artifacts and chronicles them. It's a very emotional, interactive experience, and it's just a flat wall. So this is actually the response. Well, we want to see something a little more narrative, something we can recognize. And I've seen that before. And in fact, the descendant group was going to create a survey to find out whether they preferred a narrative or abstract. That's not how artists work. Artists work with ideas, and it doesn't matter where it is, but it's how you develop that idea so that it really, engages people. And clearly this version of the Vietnam Memorial was a complete disappointment.
Yeah.
This is an image of 9/11, and I love this image. This was of the Twin Towers, and these are the beams of light that used to, the notion of the absence and used to create the presence of the building. This was when people were still recovering from the whole, trauma of having these buildings blow up. So
I thought this was genius.
yeah,
This,
absolutely.
I burst into tears when I saw it for the first time.
It's as powerful as the Myolins.
I agree. Yeah.
It just
even now I have tears pricking,
It's beyond the current memorial at
100%. Yeah.
100%. I agree. Well, the other thing that I prefer, and this is a problem in terms of energy, is I prefer performance art to enduring memorials because they're too static. But you never get anywhere if you only do performance art. They disappear. I mean, this is redone every year, and there's someone who's funding this. But if you're an artist doing performance art, that's it. It happens. It's done, and not until your next performance. So it's at some point you do want something a little more permanent. So this is an example of the permanence, and I think of this as excessive. I mean, this is like an art project. And if you go there and you hear the sound of the rushing water and the void, so Germany used the image of the void a lot in its memorials, but here it is this incredible void that's part of the memorial itself. If you go inside the museum, you see these things that are called art objects, and these are commemorative objects that evoke emotion. So this is an object that I love a great deal. This comes from a flag that was found at 9/11. It was in tatters. And what they did, someone rescued the flag, and then it was sent to all 50 states for repairs. And they used decommissioned flags to repair this. So if you're talking about a community project, this is a superb community project. And you see you see how it's repaired. And you listen to the story, and it's incredibly moving. And this is an object. This isn't a memorial. This is just an object, like the mourning shroud. It's at that level. And I felt the mourning shroud, with all of the descendants holding on to it, had that same kind of power. This is a stairway. Look at that. I mean, it's unbelievably powerful next to a regular stairs. But here's just an object. And when Ilya wrote this description that I would be in charge of making the Holocaust memorial objects, I thought, what's he talking about? I'm making a memorial. And then I thought, no, I'm going to actually be making an object. And I'm going to try to figure out how to do that in a very powerful fashion. So this is an example of an object that is incredibly powerful and static, but it doesn't get boring. It is, you see it, and it creates an immediate empathic response. I could have been running down those stairs. This is two different artists interpreting the Arc of Triumph in Paris, which was a victory, a symbol of victory. So Christo wrapped it in cloth, and it was gorgeous. And it happened after he died. This was something that he had wanted to do his whole life. And they said, okay, this is our gift, we'll do it. And it's gorgeous. I mean, I don't know how much it cost. And what's so powerful about wrapping a big building? So what I've read is really the power of unwrapping it, where you give birth to it for a second time. And this is such an important national monument. Look at these pictures, they're unbelievable. So take the same object, the same concept of the Arch de Triomphe, and Christoph Wodiko, who lives in Cambridge and works at Harvard, created a different kind of memorial. And this was an anti-war memorial on top of this arc. It's called the Institute for the Abolition of War. And he designed it. And do you think anyone's interested? No. This is too much critical thinking. This is our arc. This is our arc of victory. This is our identity. That you're making us work too hard. Anyway, never happened. And this is about the question of how is memory transformative. So there's transitional memory and there's transformative. And transformative follows transitional, which is how do you end wars? How do you recreate, cultural institutions and countries and laws? But transformative memory is to really look at what the issues were that led to the war and how do you correct those issues. And, he spent a lot of time developing this idea. That is
it's another museum.
So this is the Reichstag in Berlin. This is what it used to look like, and then it was set on fire, which was part of how Hitler came to power. And this is how it looked when Hitler was in power. And this is how it looks today. It's unbelievable. These architects created this dome, and in the dome, you walk around and there are mirrors. So I went to Germany, the country that basically orchestrated the murder of my family, and I could see myself in the mirror in the Parliament of Germany. I mean, there was some transformation of that experience that I thought was incredibly transformative and powerful. This is just a short couple of visuals about this woman, Jenny Wurstenberg, who I found recently, who talks about public democracy and memory. So the question is, why doesn't memory work, really? Why is it that we're still killing and hating? So I don't know if you can see all the words. Some of them are cut off. But she talked about civic memory and how, and I've talked about this, that civic memory is wedded to democracy, to the values of democracy, to groups of people, to pluralism. And she used the example of the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And I don't know if you're familiar with this history in Argentina, but what happened is these are mothers and grandmothers of the victims. And what happened under a dictatorship in Argentina, I think it was in the 1970s, they took the dissidents, they brought them to they tortured them, and then they took them to the ocean in planes and they dropped them into the sea. And that's why they're called the disappeared, because there's no evidence of their bodies. And these are the grandmothers that spent years protesting every year. Where are our children? And the children who had young children were actually taken and given to the regime and were adopted, and that they didn't even know what their identities were. So they were adopted by the people that killed their parents. And we're seeing this in Ukraine. These are the tricks of war that get repeated over and over again. So you see how these people had their sort of trademark, which was wearing kerchiefs. So now these grandmothers have died. So I found this. So this is actually a memorial at the site where they dropped the bodies into the ocean. So the question is, how do you make a memorial about disappearance? Could you make like an underwater memorial, or use a plane to make a memorial? Or do you just take a walk to the water and think about the disappeared? And now this is actually the police station. They now finally made a kind of museum at the police station, because this has been a contested genocide that they have not acknowledged. But I found this most moving. This is a performance. This is temporary. And this is because the grandmothers of these disappeared are dead. And now they're memorializing the people who memorializing their children. And I just found this to be incredibly powerful. As it goes from generation to generation. So this is a conclusion. If our objective is to create a deeply democratic society, the process of remembering that we have to look at the context of how we remember, like the context of looking at that sign in Porter Square and the context of Columbia, colluding and capitulating to Trump. You know, how we understand and process and stand our ground is the big question. And this is just one of this is our environment. This is the environment that we're living in. This is the corruption in the Oval Office. So the notion that memory is never set in stone as democratic because it can never operate in isolation. It is always understood in relation to the transformation of society and its historical discourse. In other words, change is part of understanding the history. So how am I going to make a memorial? Can I make a memorial in Latvia based on this understanding? I think that's it. Oh, I think I had a bunch of questions, but nothing significant than that. So that's a big question. You know, how do you make permanent memorials when you acknowledge that we live in a volatile culture of change?
I was really moved in Budapest by the shoes.
Yes.
And okay, so I saw it twice. I saw it on a Jewish tour with a tour guide, just a private tour. And then when we went on and she mentioned that they might not talk about it the same way. And sure enough, when we went with the Viking riverboat tour, they didn't talk about who it was that had been forced into the river. It was very interesting to be prepared. I had been prepared for that to happen, and it was still surprising. I mean,
yeah,
it's a very moving memorial because it's empty shoes, bronze shoes at the river, and yeah, it's
so in Latvia. After the Holocaust, there are 2 memorials that were built there. They don't mention the Jews. I mean, they were the primary victims in Latvia. So Russia does not do that. And they prohibited any kind of memory. So people don't have memory that they can, you know, they don't have family conversations. They didn't learn in school about memory. And we're now in a situation where we're talking about patriotic education. Well, what does that mean? What kind of education are kids going to have? And if it's not federally funded, we're going to, you know, there's going to be different histories about this country in different states.
it's already happening. If you look at what some of the, and I'm in Texas. I'm sorry, and the books that they're giving the schools, well, it's not books, it's a curriculum that they have to actually copy. So the money goes to copy it, is it's a reading curriculum that leaves out anything but, and has Christian Bible quote stories. I mean, some of that's our Bible stories too, but the Judeo-Christian and nothing else, and barely mentions other things. And it's up to each school district to adopt it or not.
Right.
So it's not like the state saying you have to do this, but it's out there. And I'm very scared that our kids already don't get the education that some of us got in civics and history.
Yep.
They don't know the things that we grew up being taught.
Yep.
You can ask them, they don't. They just don't know it. And that's the mission of the Holocaust museums, that when they take the school groups through, it's not just Holocaust. It's they really, I know the one in Houston, yes, it's Holocaust and it's school groups, but it's also all some of the other exhibits are about other things that have been happening more recently in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Making the kids aware of that. And it's so important.
Well, it seems, especially now when we're looking at an autocratic government, and we're talking about fascism, that the Holocaust history is, in fact, not irrelevant anymore to what's happening today.
I see Kate's hand up. Kat,
you gotta undo your mic.
sorry, I'm a Jew by choice. And you'd be surprised how many people know nothing about Judaism and very little about the Holocaust. And because I was a Catholic for years, they feel more comfortable asking me questions about Judaism. They're afraid to ask even, and that's sad. I don't think I don't want to go to more museums for the Holocaust. Memorials I'll go to. The one in Berlin is stunning.
Yeah.
And but another building where you're looking at pictures and reading signs, that doesn't teach you a lot. That doesn't reach your soul.
Right.
So
Right.
I think what you're doing is better.
Which is interesting in the Riga project, which is a deep, deep project for me. I could not get to this place without first working with historians. And I needed to know the history more clearly. And I needed to capture it and document it. But now we've done that. And now we need the artists. And, me in particular, I hope. Because in the end, it's the artists that do that transformative work.
A lot of writers writing about the Second World War and the Holocaust. There's a vast abundance of things coming out.
Yeah.
So, that'll help.
Yeah.
I have the feeling we could talk for another hour, and I really think that I can't thank Karen enough for the preparation and presentation that she brought to us today. I think we have a lot to think about. I'm going to throw in one last question and then just encourage you all to connect with the JWAN group if you're motivated, if you're an artist. We're interested in you connecting with us and WCA. I can put that in the chat, how to do that. And Karen, we would like to follow your continued project. I was wondering if there had been any consideration of having people do embroidery who were the children or grandchildren of survivors or those who perished. And if it takes an extraordinary amount of organization, I would think, to get a volunteer thing like that going, but it could be a very meaningful project for people, I suppose. So I just wondered if that had been considered.
So I have a bunch of ideas in my head rolling around, and that was certainly one, that we make, sort of mini mourning shrouds, and that we would assemble those, as a performance installation into the memorial and maybe return it every year or whatever. It is the reason why I said it costs $10,000 to finish the memorial is because it's huge. It's 8 feet by 12 feet. You can't embroider, detailed embroidery on that kind of size. So you have to use machine embroidery, which is not as beautiful, but this particular company is very skilled. So it actually, embroidery is one of the most time-consuming art forms.
Yeah.
Because it's stitch by stitch. But yes, I would love that. I would love, I mean, I did originally before doing this morning shroud, I talked with Ilya about, are there embroiderers in Latvia that would do this, that we could, craftspeople that would be willing to do this. But, he didn't know of how to reach them, and what he showed me was not of the quality that I would like. But yes, there's so much potential here to keep things going and moving. But right now I'm really focused and excited about making a memorial that answers all these questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, I'm so
I really
happy.
enjoyed the
Really interesting and provocative.
So getting grants is your whole other project that you've had to work very hard for, I know, and we don't have time to really discuss that, but Yeah, it's
I will just mention that the WCA once again saved me. I spent 2 years looking for a fiduciary relationship, and I couldn't find one anywhere. I contacted all over Boston. You would not believe the organizations that refused to give me a 501c3 for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And WCA agreed, and that allowed me to do the Day of Remembrance, which was a significant event. So I am very grateful to the WCA.
and what that means is that the funds were administered through our 501.
That's right. So I still was responsible to write the grants, to write the invoices, and have people that I hired submit those. All of that had to go in advance to Karen Luna. And then she deposited, the money came to her, the account specified for this project, and it was distributed by her, and she did it incredibly effectively and on a timely basis. I didn't touch the money, which is great because I didn't particularly want to, but it's a lot of work, and it's 7% overhead that is paid to make sure it all happens properly and effectively. But it was low bureaucracy. It was, and it was a lot of, I don't know. I mean, every now and then I would call her and I said, well, I'm having this problem. And she would just be supportive. And it was so great.
Wonderful.
We're
Yeah.
really glad that WCA was able to do that.
Yeah. The project would have really stopped, come to a halt.
Well, it's rewarding to know that you were able to continue with it. It was this is an amazing project, and it keeps evolving and evolving and evolving and evolving. And I'm just fascinated to see how, because I remember the Forest Project that I think you did a panel on it at the Boston, yes. And I just thought that was incredible, and to see how that was really the seed that started.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's really interesting to have heard your whole entire process of how you move from one project into another, and how the one before it informed the next is fascinating. Thank you.
I mean, that happens to all of us that are doing
it. Does, but it was just having seen that one project, been there when you were talking about it, and now seeing, I don't know how many years later is it?
2002 or
20 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's come out of it is inspiring to me, really inspiring.
It also reminds us of how blind life is, that we don't know the future. We just have to
just got to keep plugging away, baby.
Yeah.
Going.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you for some of you for staying this long with us.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks again.
Bye.
And hope to see some of you again. Bye now.
Bye.